Good evening and welcome to this week's edition of Behind Headlines. 60 years ago, on the 22nd of November 1963, US President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. And in this program, we will be marking the 60th anniversary of the assassination of JFK, looking at his legacy, not only in terms of domestic policy, but also foreign policy. And we'll also be asking who really did kill JFK. And in this program tonight, I'm joined by my good friend, Robert Harris, who's somewhat of an expert in American politics. So, Robert, welcome to Behind Headlines.
It's nice to be here today.
Yeah. And Robert, before we kind of unpack the incredible legacy that is John F. Kennedy, not only was he the youngest ever president in US history at the age of 43, but obviously one of those shortest ever lived presidency, and yet his short life had such a huge impact, not only in the United States, but around the world. And of course, when we remember what happened on November the 22nd, 1963, even though we weren't born, everyone who was alive then remembers exactly where they were when Kennedy was assassinated. So just on reflection, what are your thoughts regarding the assassination of JFK and also a bit on his legacy?
Well, as you say, people who were around at the time remember exactly where they were. It's almost like Princess Diana when she died in the car tunnel in Paris. Everyone knew where they were on that day. It's etched into the memories of people throughout the world, and it's had a profound impact, the JFK assassination, not just on the American people, but also, I think, on people throughout the world, because he represented, I think, a presidency that was always looking forward. I mean, his wonderful oratory, it was very compelling, and he used the most lofty language. He had the most lofty ideals that were expressed through his many speeches. And he had this knack of energizing his listeners, and he expressed his promises, I think, in a spirit of adventure, in a spirit of hope. And I think people very much were attracted to that.
Absolutely. And of course, you were telling me prior to the programme that you had the privilege of sitting down in the office of his Secretary of Defence, McNamara, who took a major role in coordinating the America's effort during the Vietnam campaign. Share with us what it was like to actually meet one of JFK's personal appointments to the Secretary of Defence.
Well, this was back in 1998. I was in Washington, D.C., and I had a planned appointment to meet Robert McNamara. I had written to him, and it was to do some photography. The meeting was only limited to about 20 minutes. I had hoped it would be a lot longer than that, but I had to be grateful that he would give me 20 minutes. And he made it very clear at the beginning that he needed to go to the pharmacy to collect some tablets, some medication. So I'd have to, be quick within that 20-minute period. And I remember he wore trainers, but he was relatively formally dressed otherwise, but very, very polite. And it was obviously a great honour to meet someone like him.
Oh, absolutely. So let's remind ourselves exactly what happened 60 years ago today. So on the 22nd of November 1963, the US President then, John F. Kennedy, was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. This is where the President of the free world was assassinated, and he was on the campaign trail hoping to get re-elected for the presidential election in 1964. To this day, there is evidence is not clear if the assassination of JFK was carried out by the lone gunman, Lee Harvey Oswald, or whether this was an inside job done on behalf of US intelligence services. 60 years ago, the Central Intelligence Agency, known as the CIA, has still not released the thousands of files and documents to the public regarding that fateful day back on November the 22nd, 1963. It's also important to discuss, as we will in this program, the legacy of JFK, the youngest man ever to win the presidency in November 1960, and his own administration known effectively as Camelot. The Kennedy family were the closest that the Americans have ever come to royalty. On the domestic front, President Kennedy was a strong advocate for social change. With the emergence of the civil rights movement and segregation of the South America, he was also determined to be the first president to put a man on the moon, which led to the space race against the Soviet Union in the 1960s. On foreign policy, he had recovered from the disastrous Bay of Pigs fiasco that occurred in 1961 to overthrow Fidel Castro in Cuba. And he was not in favour of the war in Vietnam, even though he did escalate the number of US troops posted to Vietnam to prop up Diem's regime. But he also was famous for averting a nuclear holocaust during the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962. And of course, his presidency was very much framed within the conflict that is known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. And yeah, Robert, I remember when that film came out in 2000, of actually being in New York and going to see that film about JFK's handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis in 2000, and watching that film in New York as well. And when you're spending a lot of time in the United States, that you could go around the stores and the political shops and it's all full of JFK memorabilia. So we know even today that 60 years on, he's still a very popular president. He's very much a loved president. Even though he was a Democrat, he was so interested in promoting democracy and freedom around the world. Your thoughts?
Well, there's so much to unpack with the Kennedy presidency. I mean, with regards to the Cuban Missile Crisis, yes, there were 13 days in October of 1962 when the world was literally on the brink of possible nuclear war. And we can only imagine what that felt like. A huge amount has been written about that period of time. And of course, now historians have the benefit of consulting the videotapes, or I should say the recordings of the discussions that Kennedy had with his advisors. So we can get a very close perspective on what Kennedy was thinking, how he articulated, how he deliberated upon all the problems, and how he tried to resolve the issues when he had all these different voices from his advisors telling him what he should do. I think in all of this, on the one hand, we should say, yes, he came across as a president who demonstrated great statesmanship. I think that's undoubtedly the case. I think we also need to be aware that when it was resolved, there was something that was not known at the time, I understand, and that was that America had missiles in Turkey. And it was agreed privately at the time between JFK and Khrushchev that the American military presence from Turkey would be removed, at least the nuclear weapons. So Khrushchev, of course, felt that that was acceptable, and it came to a successful resolution. So I think that needs to be understood as well in the context of why it came to a successful conclusion. But having said that, Kennedy, it could have been somebody else who was unhinged and who wanted to, not take the right course. It could have gone in the other direction. Yeah, very easily.
But also the fact that he actually believed in diplomacy was also angered many in the Hawks, in the Pentagon, and many of those in the military establishment, thinking that here in this Cold War that America's given ground and territory to the Soviets. And of course we know that despite the fact that the United States and the Soviet Union never went to war, they were at war through different regions of the world. So we have to see, for example, the Korean War in the context of the Cold War. The Vietnam War was certainly in the context of the Cold War, and even including the war in Afghanistan with the Russian invasion of Afghanistan in the context of the Cold War. So all these major conflicts, and even the kind of Middle Eastern wars such as the Six-Day War, the Yom Kippur War, also have to be seen within the context of the Cold War. As the two major superpowers were domineering who was going to be the most powerful and dominant power in the world between those two forces that emerged after the Second World War. We're going to have a look now at the biography of John F. Kennedy. So according to Britannica, John F. Kennedy was born on the 29th of May 1917 in Brookline, Massachusetts, and he is of Irish descent. His family are Irish Catholics. He was the second of 9 children, as we can see in that excellent photo there. The Kennedy was reared in a family that demanded intense physical and intellectual competition amongst the siblings. The family's touch football games at their Hinris Port retreat later became became legendary and was schooled at the religious teachings of the Roman Catholic Church and the political precepts of the Democrat Party. And there we see a picture there of the young JFK with his father. His father, Joseph Patrick Kennedy, was an acquired multimillionaire, earned his fortune in banking and bootlegging, shipbuilding, and also the film industry, and as well as a skilled player of the stock market. We see then that his mother Rose was the daughter of JFK, known as Honey Fitzgerald, and was one time the mayor of Boston. Then trusted their funds for their children that guaranteed a lifelong financial independence. And after serving as head of Securities and the Exchange Commission, Joseph Kennedy became the US ambassador to Great Britain for 6 months in 1938. John served as his secretary, drawing on that experience to write his senior thesis at Harvard University, was in 1940. So he wrote his book on Great Britain's military unpreparedness, and then he expanded his thesis into a best-selling book, Why England Slept. So we can already see that his father was America's ambassador to the United Kingdom just before the start of the Second World War. So I suppose that gave the young JFK real insight into international politics, diplomacy. He can see the rise of Nazism, and he can see how our nation, Great Britain, was becoming fearful, particularly with a huge build-up of military forces in Germany. Your thoughts?
I think that background is hugely significant. Joseph Kennedy, his father, was appointed in 1937 to the Court of St. James, which is the fancy title for being an ambassador to the United Kingdom. He was there until 1940. Now, he didn't like the course that the British government were taking with regards to Nazism. He preferred appeasement. And of course, as we know, Chamberlain eventually and Churchill were certainly not for appeasement. I say Chamberlain eventually because he did declare war on September 3rd, 1939. Joseph Kennedy didn't really fit into that narrative. So he had to resign eventually. But just a little known fact, when Joseph Kennedy was living in London, of course, John F. Kennedy was actually living in London as well for a very short period of time, and very close to the Albert Hall, Royal Albert Hall, literally a few yards from there, there's one of those lovely blue plaques which tell you that John Fitzgerald Kennedy lived here. Little known fact about Kennedy and his links to London. But his father was a huge influence. I mean, as you say, the diplomacy in the background, and also Joseph Kennedy was a huge figure in the business world. Another little known fact about Joseph Kennedy is that he was a movie mogul. He was a significant figure in the early days of Hollywood as a financier and a production figure. He linked up with one of the great silent screen stars, Gloria Swanson, in one of his business deals. So this is somebody who was a major figure in the world of finance, in the world of the film industry, in the world of diplomacy. And he was also appointed by Franklin D. Roosevelt to be the chair of the Securities and Exchange Commission, which was, and I don't know if they still have a commission by the same name, but it's a hugely significant role on a public body. So this is a significant figure. So you can imagine the young JFK being under the influence of this major figure in the background. That certainly helped in his intellectual development.
Absolutely, and of course we know that war broke out, and for example, the United States joined the war on the 7th of December 1941 after the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. So John Kennedy, after he graduated in 1940, in the autumn of 1941, joined the US Navy, and in 1943 was sent to the South Pacific. There we see him in his naval uniform, and he had just escaped death whilst commanding a patrol torpedo boat. And this is, I think, where the legend of JFK really begins, because it says there that he was gravely injured when a Japanese destroyer sank his ship in the Solomon Islands. Marooned far behind enemy lines, he led his men back to safety and was awarded the US Navy and Marine Corps Medal for heroism. He also returned to active command at his own request. These events were later depicted in a Hollywood film called P.T. that was produced and shown in 1967 that added to the mystique that was Kennedy. So not a bad credentials, is it? So you've got a father who's extremely influential, obviously very influential in the Democrat Party. As you say, was a very influential businessman, a diplomat as well. And now his son is a war hero. But his older brother was the one that was going to be tipped to be the candidate who would run and enter into politics. But sadly, he died during the Second World War. So that responsibility fell on Kennedy. And to think that Kennedy, his first opportunity to enter into politics was in 1946, where he ran for Congress. He was only 29 at the time. So it shows you that his ideals were that he was young, he was exciting, he was a kind of dynamic politician that has never lost an election in his history. And I just want to read out this because this is really impressive. It says that his first opportunity came in 1946 when he ran for Congress. Although still physically weak from his war injuries, he campaigned aggressively, bypassing the Democratic organization in Massachusetts in the 11th Congressional District, and depended instead upon his family, college friends and fellow naval officers. And in the Democratic primary, he received nearly double the amount of votes of his nearest opponent, and in November's election, he overwhelmed the Republican candidate with only 29. And he served in the House of Representatives Congress from 1947 to 53. So we see a little bit more of his makeup, Robert. So for example, here it said that he advocated for better working conditions, more public housing, higher wages, lower prices, cheaper rents, and more social security for the aged. So he was like what we'd probably describe today as a compassionate conservative, but it's his foreign policy that really strikes me. So he was an early supporter of the Cold War policies. He backed the Truman Doctrine, and President Truman's policy was then, and this is the ideal that maybe the United States should stand up today, is that the United States would provide political, military, and economic assistance to all democratic nations under threat from external or internal authoritarian forces. Something I learned in this program today about the Truman Doctrine, which I very much like and advocate.
Well, of course, the thing that comes to mind is President Truman's Secretary of State, George C. Marshall, the famous Marshall Plan, which was a huge plan where aid would be given to certain countries in Europe. And the motive wasn't purely compassionate. It was rather about preventing the possibility of the spread of communism, which was, of course, a great concern with the American power establishment of the time.
Yeah, so I'm just going to move on quite a lot because you can imagine with the life of JFK, his achievements are quite extraordinary. So in 1952, he ran for the US Senate against the popular incumbent known as Harry Cabot Lodge Jr., and his mother and sister Eunice and Patricia, and also Jean, held Kennedy teas across the state. That is the Massachusetts state in New England. We see there that thousands of volunteers flocked to help, including his 27-year-old brother Robert, who managed his campaign. And of course, Robert then went on to become his Attorney General in the White House. He says that fall, the Republican presidential candidate, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, famous for leading the campaign against the Nazis in Europe, carried Massachusetts by 200,000 votes, but Kennedy defeated Lodge by some 70,000 votes. Less than a year later, on September the 12th, 1953, Kennedy enhanced his electoral appeal by marrying then the Jacqueline Lee Bouvier, known as Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, 12 years younger than Kennedy, and from a socially prominent family. The beautiful Jackie was the perfect complement to the handsome politician. They made a glamorous couple. And I suppose this is where the whole thing of Camelot comes in. Mm-hmm. This is where the comparisons with the royal family come in, that America has its own kind of royal family in the Kennedys.
It's interesting, though, because Jacqueline Kennedy's sister, Lee, she became, in name only, a princess. She was married 3 times, and her second husband was a Polish aristocrat. So Lee actually used the title princess, But we have to remind ourselves, of course, in terms of the Polish legal system, they didn't recognise it because it was communist, and it was only in name only. It's rather like the exiled royal families of Europe. You know, that the sons continue holding the names prince, but no one really recognises it. It's just a sense of carrying the heritage. But that's just an interesting background to actual royalty within that wider family.
Wow,
or aristocracy,
yeah.
if you like.
So back in 1955, whilst recuperating from a back operation, he wrote The Profiles of Courage, the accounts of 8 great American political leaders who had defied popular public opinion in matters of conscience, and he won then the Pulitzer Prize in history. And in 1956, Kennedy almost gained the Democratic nomination for vice president, and 4 years later was the first ballot nominee for president. We see that Kennedy had nearly become Stephenson vice presidential running mate in 1956, but the charismatic young New Englander, as he was known then, near victory, and his televised speech actually then accelerated him to the American public conscience, where over 40 million people watched him in his home. So we can see here that, and this is the thing that's so extraordinary about JFK, is that he was essentially a politician that was maybe 3 decades ahead of his time, understood the power of television, understood the power of this new technology, and was able then to use that for political gain and political advantages.
That's absolutely right. I think you mentioned the Pulitzer Prize. I think there's an interesting thing that we can weave into this discussion. So Jackie is understood to have encouraged him to write that book, and it was published in 1956. He got the Pulitzer Prize in 1957. But a fact that is now widely recognised is that his speechwriter, Ted Sorensen, was responsible for writing most of that text. And of course, Sorensen is widely regarded as having written many of Kennedy's speeches. Now, of course, nothing is new about this. Presidents have their speechwriters. But the famous speech the inauguration speech, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. There's a little uncertainty as to whether Sorensen actually wrote those words, but he wrote most of that speech. And Kennedy himself refers to Sorensen as his intellectual lifeblood. So let's bring him into the picture as well. And I do get the sense that although Kennedy was an extremely powerful man in his own right, intellectually, in terms of his charisma, his thinking, his ability to communicate to the masses, but every great man or woman has a great person behind them. So I think the great person behind the throne, at least one of them, was Ted Sorensen.
That's good. Yeah, no, because politicians need it.
Absolutely.
Definitely. So also we see here that his campaign for the 1960 presidential elections had begun. One newspaper called him a young man in a hurry. Kennedy felt that he had to redouble his efforts because of widespread conviction that no Roman Catholic candidate could be elected as president. And in his 1958 race for re-election to the Senate, was a test of his popularity in Massachusetts. His margin of victory was 874,608 votes, the largest ever in Massachusetts politics, and the greatest of any senatorial candidate that year. He had tackled the Catholic issue again by vowing his belief in the separation of church and state in a televised speech before a group of Protestant ministers in Houston, Texas. Nominated on the first ballot, he balanced the Democratic ticket by choosing Johnson as his running mate. And we see there that Kennedy won the election, narrowly defeating the Republican candidate and former Vice President Richard M. Nixon by a margin of 120,000 votes, some of those out of the 70 million that were actually cast. So we see here that if we go down in terms of his TV debate, so we have the stats up there as well. But I mean, this takes me back, Robert, to my university lectures and being lectured in US history and learning about the first presidential TV debate in history, and how, for example, that I think with his father's background knowledge in television really helped him, because he actually wore a navy, as you can see JFK there wearing a navy suit and a navy tie against a grey background. because he knows that he would actually stand out and look colourful. And of course, then we see his challenger, Richard Nixon, wearing a grey suit, which means he didn't actually stand out very well. And they did a survey by asking, who do you think won those presidential election debates? And those who watched television at the time, I think now 60 Americans had television. So those who watched that debate on television say Kennedy won, but those who listened on the radio said that actually Nixon won. So I think here again we see the birth and the influence of technology in politics, and of course it's with us massively today.
I think we have a parallel in this country. So in 1953, when the Queen was crowned in Westminster Abbey, it was the very first event when the whole nation could actually be in front of the television set, quite literally, and watch this magnificent historic occasion. I think in America, this was probably on a very similar footing. And of course now it's moved on significantly. Although the television debates still hold sway, it's now what people write on Twitter or some other social media platform, and that's really what carries weight. The television thing has faded away somewhat, I think.
Yeah. But isn't it amazing how presidents use technology? For example, Roosevelt used the radio.
The radio address, the fireside chats.
Exactly. Right. This was his chance to actually then communicate directly to the American people. And of course then with Kennedy it was the kind of TV debates. I think Clinton was another one who was very good in front of the television, very charismatic as well, and having actually heard one of Bill Clinton's speeches in President with the opening of the Veterans Memorial for the World War II veterans was very moving and very powerful. You can see how charismatic he was, and of course using television, and then of course with the influence of the internet and social media is really then that for example Trump could communicate to the American people and bypass the American media by his kind of Twitter feeds, and write a Twitter feed early in the morning to stir up a lot of controversy, so all the journalists would be responding to what he said, which then allowed him to get on with the business of running the country.
Indeed.
So it shows you how technology is so important. But to be almost like a television personality in 1960, when television was coming into its own, really did show that he was ahead in terms of understanding technology and how the media would work. How much do you think that actually helped him win the election, which was a very close election in 1960?
Well, hugely significant, because we all know it's not just about what politicians say, it's also about their image. Sadly, we live in a world where there's this superficial idea. It's about how you come across, how you dress, your mannerisms, your facial expressions, your body language. And they do say, psychologists, that body language accounts for significantly more than the language you use. I mean, we're talking a huge gulf between the words and the actual body language. So television, you can see how that medium at that time had a profound impact on the election and on people's judgments as to which politician would best serve the nation's interests.
Yeah, so he was the youngest man at 43 and the first Roman Catholic ever to be elected President of the United States. His administration lasted for 1,037 days. From the onset, he was concerned with foreign affairs, and in his inaugural address, he called upon the Americans to bear the burden of a long twilight struggle against the common enemies of man. They are tyranny, poverty, disease, and war itself. He declared, "In the long history of the world, only a few generations have been granted the role of defending freedom in its hour of maximum danger. I do not shrink from this responsibility. I welcome it. The energy, the faith, the devotion which we bring to this endeavour will light our country and all who serve it. And the glow from that fire can truly light the world. And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." I'm inspired. I'm inspired by
you can't be. I think that those words about ask not what your country can do for you and so on, the thing that comes to mind is, look, today we live in a world where there's a great struggle for human rights. And of course, if you go back to the post-war period, there was the atrocities of Nazism, Stalinism and so on. They had to actually work out a framework which became the UN Charter for Human Rights, of course. So all of that needs to be understood as background. And of course, this is a struggle in many countries where freedoms that we take for granted in the Western world, they simply don't exist there. However, there's a different perspective here in this speech. This is not about what we can get from the country, what our entitlements are from the government, as important as those might be. It's about what we can give to the world, what we can give to the community, to the country. And I think that kind of emphasis is almost unheard of today. People don't want to know about what their service should be to the world, to the community. Perhaps it sounds too Christian for some people, I don't know. But Kennedy certainly really, I think that speech and so many other speeches, there was great resolve and loftiness in his thoughts that really reached into the souls of every man and woman. And I think that's just very powerful.
Yeah, I remember reading that the Kennedy memorial that's actually in Runnymede itself, right next to the Magna Carta, which I think is very fitting. But you know, as a Democrat then, and sadly when we look back at history 60 years ago, we're marking today the assassination of JFK and looking at his legacy, the one thing you get from JFK back then 60 years ago was America's determination to spread democracy and freedom around the world. Today, in the 21st century, we hardly hear anything about Western governments fighting against tyranny or defending democracy. And I don't mean just kind of putting a mark on a ballot paper and putting it into a kind of electoral box to see who's going to win the election. I mean the kind of institutions of democracy, which are a free to elect your own government and to elect your own head of state, to have a free judiciary, to have a free press, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion. I mean, these are all universal freedoms, but sadly today, Western governments around the world no longer seem interested in defending these ideals. It's more about kind of climate change, or it's more about globalism, and there's less emphasis on responsibility to defend freedom against evil. And also in his day, he understood very much for moral clarity. I guess that was from his time fighting against the Imperial Japanese and also fighting against the Germans during the Second World War.
Well, on the subject of democracy and the freedoms that you cite, I think today the Western governments are very happy to promote these ideals abroad through various initiatives at the UN and so on. I mean, America is well known still to be trying to export democracy in the Middle East and so forth. But there are some very important questions which many people don't want to look at about what is going on domestically within these countries and how these great institutions that have taken centuries to cultivate, how they may be at serious risk. So I think there's that distinction. Promoting it abroad, yes, but what about looking at what's going on within one's own country and how those standards are being maintained, well or not?
Absolutely. So let's have a look now some of the foreign policy achievements achieved under JFK and his very short-lived administration. We see that his administration's first brush with foreign affairs was a disaster. In the last year of the Eisenhower presidency, the CIA, known as the Central Intelligence Agency, had equipped and trained a brigade of anti-communist Cuban exiles for an invasion of their homeland. The Joint Chief of Staffs unanimously advised the new president that this force, once ashore, would spark a general uprising against the Cuban leader Fidel Castro, who was a communist. Known as the Bay of Pigs invasion, was a complete fiasco. Every man on the beachhead was either killed or captured. Kennedy assumed sole responsibility for the setback, privately told his father that he would never again accept a Joint Chiefs recommendation without first challenging it. The Soviet Premier Khrushchev thought he had taken the young president's measures when the two leaders met in Vienna in 1961. Khrushchev ordered a wall to be built between East and West Berlin and threatened to sign a separate peace treaty with East Germany. The president activated the National Guard and reserve units, and Khrushchev backed down on his separate peace threat. And then we see that Kennedy made a dramatic visit to West Berlin, where he was told, cheering the crowd, "Today, in the world of freedom, the proudest boast, I am a Berliner." In October 1962, a build-up of Soviet short-range and intermediate-range nuclear missiles was discovered in Cuba. Kennedy demanded that the missiles be dismantled. He'd ordered the quarantine of Cuba in effect, a blockade that would stop Soviet ships from reaching that island. And for 13 days, war seemed near. The Soviet premier announced that the offensive weapons would be withdrawn. I mean, this was an incredible diplomatic achievement, I think, on behalf of Kennedy and his administration to actually prevent a nuclear war from taking place during the Cuban Missile Crisis.
There can't be anything more important than preventing any war, especially nuclear war of all things. I think we have to go back a few steps, and this is a huge subject, of course, and we won't have time to go into all the details, but people might be asking, why was Kennedy so worried about communism? Where everyone stands, they might be asking that question. We have to go back to the end of the war. There was the Cold War that started, so there was a build-up of nuclear weapons on both the USA and the USSR side, and there was a race who could get the most nuclear weapons. And there was a huge suspicion on both sides about the other's motives, and there was a terrible hostility. There were many other occasions when the world was potentially close to, danger, but the Cuban Missile Crisis is certainly probably the high point of that. But if you go back to the Eisenhower administration, perhaps just look at that for a moment. There was the formation of the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. It's known as SEATO in 1955. There were only about six or seven members of that organization. Only 2 of them were actually Southeast Asian. The others were all mostly, apart from Pakistan, the others were all Western nations. And of course, the US would have been the leading party in that. And that was a kind of strategic defense alliance that was formed. So I think it's important to see what Kennedy did within the wider context of what he inherited from Eisenhower. So if anyone's listening and wondering, well, why did Kennedy do this? Why was he so anti this or pro this? One has to look at the background to this. And of course, capitalism is what embodied American values and in theory still does today, whereas the USSR was specifically a communist, Marxist-based system. And those 2 philosophies were very, very diametrically opposed.
But you can also break down that one as well, that you had religious freedom in the United States.
Absolutely.
Under the American system, but under the communist system, it was an atheistic system, and only the state-allowed religions were allowed to operate, such as the Russian Orthodox Church. The Jewish community were very much forbidden from practicing their Judaism. So again, this was also a clash between good and evil, between the right to belief and also within the Soviet system didn't allow any belief. So we also see that this was also a spiritual battle taking place between these 2 powers as well.
It's absolutely right. And of course, in the Soviet Union, it was an atheist state, although of course you had a few old churches that were open in the capital, which I think were just window dressing for the tourists, quite frankly. But you see, the thing is, if you have religion, whether it's organized religion or private religion, however one wants to define it, that is seen as a rival power structure to the state. And in communism, it's the state that is all powerful. So your freedom of conscience was simply not allowed to be manifested. It was only until Gorbachev came on the scene in the early 90s that there was a radical shift in freedoms and people could suddenly breathe again and discover what they really wanted to do with their lives.
Yeah. So also some of the other achievements scored by Kennedy. So 10 months later, Kennedy scored his greatest foreign policy triumph when Khrushchev and the Prime Minister Harold Macmillan of Great Britain joined him in signing the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. Yet the Kennedys' commitment to combat the spread of communism led him to escalate American involvement in the conflicts in Vietnam, where he sent not just supplies and financial assistance, but as President Eisenhower put, 15,000 US advisors there as well. So that's his foreign policy. In terms of domestic policy, because of his slender victory in 1960, Kennedy approached Congress warily. With good reason. Congress was largely indifferent to his legislative program. It approved his Alliance for Progress in Latin America and the Peace Corps, which won the enthusiastic endorsement of thousands of college students. But his 2 most cherished projects, massive income cuts, that's Democrats saying this, not the Republicans, and a sweeping civil rights measure were not passed until his death. In May 1961, Kennedy committed the United States to land a man on the moon by the end of the decade, which he achieved that in 1969. While he could not live and see that achievement, either his advocacy of the space program contributed to the successful launch of the first American manned space flights. He was an immensely popular president at home and abroad, and at times seemed to be everywhere at once, encouraging better fitness, personal fitness, improving the morale of government workers, bringing brilliant advisors to the White House, and beautifying Washington, D.C., obviously known as Camelot. His wife joined him as an advocate for American culture. Their 2 young children, Caroline Bevere and John F.K. Jr., were familiar throughout the country. The charm and optimism of the Kennedy family seemed contagious, sparking idealism of a generation of whom the Kennedy White House became, in journalist Theodore White's famous elegy, Camelot. The magical court of Arthurian legend was celebrated in the popular Broadway musical of the early 1960s, and of course became something of royalty. I mean, there's an incredible film called Jackie, and you can see how they allowed the cameras into the White House, and that Jackie Kennedy was showing the cameras around the rooms and what they would occupy. And it was almost a kind of demonstration of American power, but also American extravagance as well, and trying to say that this is a new era, a new dawn for the American people under his presidency. I mean, to have someone that was that intelligent, to bring in kind of the best minds into the White House, meant that there was a real spirit of optimism under his presidency.
Absolutely. I mean, Jackie Kennedy had a great appreciation for culture and learning about history. She led the way in having the White House restored, and lots of art from all over the place was brought into the White House. And a little known fact, the Presidential Library for JFK was actually the designer, the architect, I.M. Pei, was actually chosen by her, and he's a giant in the world of architecture. So she had a great appreciation for beauty and aestheticism, but as you say, she was highly intelligent, very, very well educated. And I have no doubt, although I haven't looked in the archives, that she probably had a very personal influence on his thinking politically. I don't know whether that's certain, but it wouldn't surprise me that she did somehow give him some input into his thinking.
Absolutely, but I mean, we have to also bring in the question that we presented him as a very charismatic president, a very much a visionary president, but he also had his moral failings as well that we can't hide, sadly.
Yes, of course, we all have our moral failings, but you're absolutely right. He did have his own moral failings. I think you said you mentioned the space program a few moments ago. There was a famous speech he gave, and it's known as "We Choose to Go to the Moon" speech. And in that speech, "We Choose to Go to the Moon," there's a sentence in that which really inspires me, and it says so much about Kennedy, the man, the politician. He said, "We choose to go to the moon not because it is easy, but because it is hard." What a thing to say. And that idea, that thinking has ramifications for so many things in life, as well as our own personal lives. So this is somebody who said things that were unheard of before. They hadn't been said. So he set a new template for how to think as a leader, I would suggest.
Absolutely. So this takes us to that fateful day on November the 22nd, 1963. And if you were alive then, will remember exactly where you were when the US president was assassinated. So let's go and have a reminder of what happened that fateful day 60 years ago.
In the 50 years since President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, countless books, articles, and movies have tried to recreate the events of November 22, 1963, and to answer the lingering questions surrounding that fateful day. In his new book, End of Days, author James Swanson sets out a minute-by-minute look at the day President Kennedy was shot. The riveting account takes readers through the streets of Dallas, all the way to Parkland Memorial Hospital, where the nation learned the president's fate. He then recreates the last hours of the doomed assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald, and documents the days of national mourning for the fallen president.
Yes, you're right, Pat. During the presidency, no one called JFK's administration Camelot. It was created 1 week later, on the 1-week anniversary of the assassination by Jackie Kennedy herself. She summoned Theodore White, the important journalist, to her home in Hyannisport, Massachusetts. He drove through a driving storm. She told him everything in a 3-hour harrowing account of being in the car, of the shots, the blood, the head exploding. And then she said, but there's something else I want to tell you. We used to listen to a record at night of the Broadway musical Camelot. Once there was a brief shining moment, a place known as Camelot. And that's what our administration was. And it'll never be that way again. She told White that over and over again. And so from her home, he wrote the story, called it into Life magazine with her standing next to him. He let her edit the story. She penciled changes. The editors in New York said, "There's enough of this Camelot. What's all this about?" Jackie was standing there and she said, "No, keep it in." The editors in New York even said, "Hey, Ted, is she listening to this right now?" He said yes, but he wanted to do it for her. He had been a Pulitzer Prize winner, but now he was not a journalist. He was acting as a courtier of the bereaved widow. And the December 6th issue of Life magazine had that story, John F. Kennedy, an epilogue. And that story ended, "It will never be that way again. Once upon a time, there was Camelot." Jackie Kennedy created the most powerful myth in American politics that night.
And that was recorded for the 50th anniversary of the assassination of JFK. I think before we also talk about his assassination, it was also, I think he wanted to really bring about big change in America, particularly the kind of segregation of African Americans in the South. And he also is known for his kind of friendship of Martin Luther King, even though the two really had the same sort of ideals, didn't they?
Yes, I mean, this was a huge issue that was going on for so long. I mean, it was only in 1954, Brown versus Board of Education, the US Supreme Court case, which ruled that it was not constitutional to have segregated schools. And when that law came into effect, it didn't really hit the ground. There were still large parts of the country that weren't actually, applying this. And there were so many other issues with voting, with sitting in restaurants, black and white together, going into hotels, going into theatres, cinemas, people just mingling normally together. That still wasn't happening properly. And in some areas it was totally absent. So Kennedy had a huge amount to resolve, and the big piece of legislation, which he can take credit for, but was eventually passed in '64, is the Civil Rights Act of '64. Robert F. Kennedy, his Attorney General, had some significant input into that. But Kennedy worked very, very hard, JFK I'm talking about here, worked very hard to actually get that passed and to have so many other initiatives. Look, he's been criticised that he didn't do enough. Some people say, well, he was worried about, not going too far, trying to strike the right balance. But many other people rightly recognise that he did a huge amount, and he reached out personally to Martin Luther King over the phone on various occasions. And after the March on Washington, he invited Martin Luther King and all the other big civil rights leaders to the White House. There was a group photograph. This is someone who genuinely believed, and by the way, he said in one of his speeches, and I forget the exact words, but it was something along the lines that although there was the Emancipation Proclamation 100 years before under Abraham Lincoln, black people, African Americans, were still not free. So there was still huge work to be done, and he was really aware of that, and he staked his reputation on that.
Yeah, and let's take us now to that fateful day in November 1963, known as November the 22nd, 1963. So President Kennedy believed that his Republican opponent in 1964 would be Senator Barry Goldwater of Arizona. He was convinced that he could bury Goldwater under an avalanche of votes, thus receiving a mandate for major legislative reforms. One obstacle to his plan was a feud between Vice President Johnson's home state of Texas, between Governor John B. Connally Jr. and Senator Ralph Yarlburg, both Democrats. To present a show of unity, the president decided to tour the state with both men on Friday, November the 22nd, 1963. He and Jackie Kennedy were in an open-air limousine riding slowly on the motorcade through downtown Dallas. At 12:30 p.m., the president was struck by two rifle bullets, one at the base of his neck and one in the head. He was pronounced dead shortly after arrival at Parkland Memorial Hospital. Governor Connolly, though also gravely wounded, recovered. And then we saw that Vice President Johnson took an oath as president at 2:38 p.m. Lee Harvey Oswald, the 24-year-old Dallas citizen, was accused of his murder. 2 days later, Oswald was shot dead by Jack Ruby, a local nightclub owner with connections to the criminal underground in the basement of a Dallas police station. A presidential commission headed by the Chief Justice of the United States, Earl Warren, later found that neither the sniper nor his killer was any part of a conspiracy, domestic or foreign, to assassinate President Kennedy, but Oswald had acted alone, known as the Warren Commission. And of course, then we see that who really did kill JFK with about 8 minutes to go. Was it the CIA, who he sacked the head of the CIA, who was resentful for that? The alienation of the military personnel within his administration for the way that he handled the Cuban Missile Crisis? Was it his links and his father's links to the mob? Was this because of communism in trying to overthrow Fidel Castro and the Soviets? Or was this an inside job carried out by the CIA? Still, 60 years on, those questions have not been answered, have they?
No. First, let me say, my instinct is to say I don't like conspiracy theories in terms of where they could possibly go, because a lot of that world of conspiracy is not grounded in fact. But at the same time, we need to have an open mind and discuss things freely and openly. The Warren Commission was headed up by Earl Warren, who was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court at the time. It was an official appointment by Lyndon Johnson, who was JFK's successor. And this commission was made up of a number of key people. There were 2 key senators on that commission who didn't exactly go along with a lot of the thinking of that commission. In fact, they, unlike the remit of the commission, as it were, they felt that it wasn't Oswald alone, and they wanted their dissenting opinions published in the final report. I understand that didn't happen. And there's a lot of controversy as to why that didn't happen, because, of course, if you have a Supreme Court ruling, it's very common to have dissenting opinions published in the report for everyone to see. So the Oswald alone theory is open to a lot of dispute. But the other thing is, Gerald Ford, who was later president, taking over from Richard Nixon following the Watergate scandal, he was also a member. And another key person was Allen Dulles, who was a former CIA leader, chief, whose own brother was Eisenhower's Secretary of State. So there were some very high-profile people in there. And some scholars also talk about J. Edgar Hoover having a direct, active influence in the remit of that commission and who was to be appointed to it. I don't know how much we need to accept that proposal. One would have to go into thousands of archives to actually make one's own mind up. But that's what's been suggested, that J. Edgar Hoover had some role in that, and that raises all sorts of questions on its own, of course.
No, absolutely. And I suppose one aspect of this one is that the only person that could have carried out that attack would have been a sniper. You'd have to have an absolute skilled marksman. And the fact that the first bullet hit his head and the second his neck, they were instant of him being hit in his crusade, as we see there with the picture there, meant that this had to be snipers, and had to be 2 of them. But the big question I think everyone's asking 60 years later, if this was an inside job, and for some reason the CIA saw JF Kennedy as a threat, why did they see him as a threat? Why did they then want to get rid of him? Because even at the time, it was considered very low security for a president. I mean, the presidential security personnel suggested they should have had a roof on those cars as they were travelling through the crowds. There was very little police there to control it. And so this was, and if he hadn't been assassinated, the likelihood he would have won an absolute landslide in the 1964 presidential election, which would have then given him a huge programme to bring about incredible reforms, even possibly pull the United States out of the Vietnam War, to bring about social justice in America, to end segregation. I mean, for administration, everything was at his feet, wasn't it?
I think so. I think he would have probably won. I think you're absolutely right. There is a whole genre of history out there. What if?
Oh, exactly.
If such and such hadn't happened, what would have happened? And of course, that can become a game in itself. But I think it seems very likely, highly likely, that he would have won a second term, because the man had such charisma. And of course, a presidency isn't only judged by the manifesto promises and the policies, but it also is measured according to how the administration responds to the unpredictable, the emergency situations. George W. Bush had that. He wasn't a foreign policy president, but he became one in the end with Iraq. So I think it's difficult to know what would have happened in the future, but I think it seems very likely that he would have been elected again. I agree.
And it also seems very strange that his brother, Robert Kennedy, was also assassinated in 1968, running for the US president. And so big question marks remain over the Kennedy curse and all that's happened with the Kennedy family since. But I suppose in reflection, we have to understand that God is sovereign and that history is his story, that he appoints men and women to positions of power, and history and nations are in his hands.
Yes, the other man we haven't mentioned is Edward Kennedy, who only died a few years ago, and he was a very influential senator for many decades representing Massachusetts. So we probably wouldn't have a proper conversation without him.
Robert, thank you so much for joining me on Behind the Headlines. You've done a great job, and fascinating to know your insights into US politics, particularly as we remember and mark the 60th anniversary of the assassination of JFK. I want to thank you for watching this programme today. I'm sure that all of you who are alive in 1963 would have remembered where you were on November the 22nd when US President John FK was assassinated, cut down in his prime. Now, of course, the big question 60 years on is, if he wasn't assassinated, what kind of president would he have been? Would he have won the 1964 presidential election? Would the world be a different place? We don't know, but we know that God is sovereign and history is his story. So thank you for watching this week's edition of Behind the Headlines.